Okay, well, this episode is our last on Locke, and what we're going to do is look at his theory of property and then look at some criticisms of Locke's theory. So when it comes to property, which plays a very important role in Locke's account of what's just, he's got a problem. The problem is this: as we've seen in the past episodes, he places a lot of emphasis on scripture, on what he reads in the Bible. And what does he read in the Bible? What he reads in the Bible is that God gave the earth to humankind in common. God gave the earth to everybody in common. And then the question is, well, if that's the case, then how do you justify the existence of private property? Because after all, private property is not common ownership. Private property is private ownership. So how do you justify this? Now, this isn't just a theoretical issue for Locke. There's a historical aspect to this too, which is known as the enclosure of the commons. And basically what's going on here is, in England of the period, not just in England, but particularly in England of the period, there's land known as commons land, and there are some of these still exist in England, so, although they're not used in quite the same way. But one might think of Wimbledon Common, for example, as an example of this. So there was commons land, and what this land would be used for is that people would take their animals to graze there. So individual people, families and whatever, they might have a cow or a goat or whatever of their own, and they would take it down to the commons to graze. And over time, this commons land became enclosed, to use the jargon, which meant it fell out of commons land and became privately owned. So over time, the commons land fell into private ownership. And Locke thinks that was a good thing, and he wants to justify it. But how can you justify it, given that, according to the scriptures, as Locke reads them, the earth was given to everybody in common, and even beside that, how would you justify commons land falling into private ownership when this was done without the consent of all the people who used the commons land? Well, here's Locke's central argument in this regard, and I've divided it up into 3 sections just so that we can see the structure of it. So Locke says, though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. Okay, so that's the notion of self-ownership, right? We own ourselves. And then he argues that we extend this. The labour of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. So I own my body, and what I do with my body is also mine. And then he extends this further. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state of nature, the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labour with it and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. It being by him removed from the common state nature placed it in, it hath by this labour something annexed to it that excludes the common right of other men. For this labour, being the unquestionable property of the labourer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where there is enough and is good left in common for others. Okay, so you see the basic structure of the argument. I own myself, therefore I own my labour, and therefore, this is questionable, but this is Locke's argument, right? Because I own my labour, therefore I own the products of my labour. Now you can see this is the workmanship idea that we've seen on a number of occasions, and it goes back to Locke's view about God's ownership of people. So remember, the idea is that we're all God's property because God created us, and we see the same idea working here. The stuff that I make is mine because I created it. I didn't create the substances, but I created the thing that I made. So if I, to take an obvious example, I suppose, if I take some clay and I make it, I mold it into a bowl or whatever, then it's mine because I've made the bowl. Okay, so just like we're God's property because God makes us, I own the bowl because I made the bowl. Now, you notice at the end of the paragraph that there's a little rider that Locke introduces. So he says, to remind you, he says, for this labour being the unquestionable property of the labourer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. So there has to be enough and as good left in common for others. And on the face of it, you might think that's a very important rider. Right? So you can't claim anything as your property if you don't leave enough and as good, enough and as good for other people. You might think that that's a very significant restriction on the ability to obtain private property, but Locke doesn't think so. This is what he says. Now, the point of this may not be immediately apparent, but let me just read it out and then I'll draw the conclusion that Locke draws from it. He says, there cannot be a clearer demonstration of anything than several nations of the Americans are of this, who are rich in land and poor in the comforts of life, who nature, having furnished as liberally as any other people with the materials of plenty, that is, a fruitful soil apt to produce in abundance what might serve for food, raiment, and delight, yet for want of improving it by labour, have not 1/100th part of the conveniences we enjoy, and a king of a large and fruitful territory there feeds, lodges, and is clad worse than a day labourer in England. Now, what's Locke saying here? He's saying that a consequence of, for example, the enclosure of the commons, a consequence of private property is wealth. And as a result, the lowest in England have a higher standard of living than, at the time he says, the highest in the Americas. Okay, so when he says that you have to leave enough and as good for other people, his take on this is, yeah, but you will, because if you privatize the commons, then sure, for example, if you privatize the commons, then on the face of it, you might say that you're not leaving much for other people, but you're creating wealth that will make everybody better off. So the enough and as good rider doesn't really come to very much, because Locke thinks you will leave, if we have a regime of private property, you will leave enough and as good in common for others, because you'll create wealth and other people will benefit from that. So that even a day labourer in England, where the commons have been enclosed, is better off than somebody in America, where they have plenty of land to themselves and so on. Okay, now one thing I really want you to see here is that what Locke is doing here is providing a justification for inequality. There's a justification for inequality. That's material inequality. He thinks we're all morally equal, but he thinks it's perfectly acceptable if we have inequality of wealth. Everyone is better off as a result of this inequality, Locke thinks, and therefore it is justified. Now you should note that there's a kind of utilitarianism in Locke's position. Now, what that means, we'll have to wait and see. Utilitarianism is our next theory, but there's a kind of, well, if it makes everyone better, then it's okay, kind of argument here. That will come back to this. You see this also in the following paragraph. God gave the world to men in common, but since he gave it them for their benefit and the greatest conveniences of life they were capable to draw from it, it cannot be supposed he meant it should always remain in common and uncultivated. He gave it to the use of the industrious and rational, and labour was to be his title to it, not to the fancy or covetousness of the quarrelsome and contentious. Okay, so on Locke's view, God gave us natural resources to use. We're supposed to use them and make the most of them. And labour does two things. It gives us title, as we lawyers would say, the right to use natural resources. That's the argument from property. And it is the way that we recognise who is industrious, who deserves to have the property. Okay, so the key takeaway from this is that in Locke's view, justice requires inequality of this kind, that is inequality of wealth. Now, you compare this to how people talk today. It's very common to hear people say today that basically justice requires equality. Right? Equality and justice are basically the same thing. Now, equality might be difficult to achieve, right? But But lots of people talk as if equality and justice were the same thing. But Locke will have none of that. Right? Locke's view is no, justice requires inequality. It's important that property goes to those who will use it the best. That's what justice requires. And you see that very clearly in the quote that I read before. Justice requires that property goes to the industrious and not to the non-industrious, not to the, what does he put it, the quarrelsome and contentious. It must go to the industrious. There must be inequality if there is to be justice. Okay, right. Now I want to turn to some criticisms of Locke's view. On the one hand, I think we have to say that Locke's argument has strong intuitive appeal. I mean, we're still talking about it hundreds of years later. There's a reason why it grabs people. But how does it work exactly? Okay, so that's just thinking of the property argument. Now, how does it work exactly? So we start off with I own myself. Well, you might question that. Do I really? I mean, I am myself. Do I own myself? But okay, let's just give that to Locke for the moment. So I own myself. So I labour on an object. I own myself. I own my labour. I labour on an object. Therefore, I own the object. How does that argument supposed to work? It's not entirely clear. Well, it's not at all clear to me how that argument is supposed to work. How does it follow from the fact that I own myself and I own my labour that I own the objects on which I labour? It doesn't seem to me that that connection is obvious at all. Locke, and you can go back and have a look at the relevant slides, Locke talks as if my labour somehow remains in the object. He talks about my labour being annexed to the object. So go back to the example where I've made the bowl out of clay. Locke talks as if my labour is still there in the bowl, right? And so taking away the bowl, taking the bowl from me would be a bit like, taking, I don't know, pulling my arm or something. But of course, that's just a metaphor. My labour's not literally in the bowl. So what are we to make of this? Well, Robert Nozick, a theorist that we're going to look at later in the course, has this to say in criticism of Locke's view. He says, why does mixing one's labour with something make one the owner of it? But that's the question I've just been asking. Perhaps because one owns one's labour, and so one comes to own a previously unowned thing that becomes permeated with what one owns. Ownership seeps over into the rest. But why isn't mixing what I own with what I don't own a way of losing what I own, rather than a way of gaining what I don't? If I own a can of tomato juice and spill it into the sea, so that its molecules, made radioactive so that I can check this, mingle evenly throughout the sea, do I thereby come to own the sea, or have I foolishly dissipated my tomato juice? Now, this is a very famous criticism of Locke's view, and it's curious that in the textbook, Shapiro suggests that, maybe this is an interesting theoretical issue, but in practice, nobody takes Nozick's criticism seriously. But I think that's quite wrong. I think we do take Nozick's criticism very seriously. Indeed, as those of you who have studied this in property law will know, that the law takes this very seriously. There's a whole lot of legal rules around mixing that deal with this, and this is something that played a very big role, for example, in the Roman law of property, where they talked about, mixing olive oil or mixing sand with somebody else's building materials and so on. So, and there are legal rules that deal with this case. And of course, as we know, in the case that Nozick talks about, if you dump tomato juice into the sea, of course it doesn't mean you own the sea, right? And there are various areas of the law, as well as property, where we see this reflected. For example, you see this reflected in the law of unjust enrichment, where in Taylor and Laird, Baron Pollock famously said, one cleans another's shoes. What can the other do but put them on? And what is Pollock saying here? He's saying that, at least in these kinds of cases, labour makes no difference at all. Right? You can labour on these things, but it doesn't give you any title. The other thing, I think in general, my own view is that in general, law doesn't seem to be all that interested in labour. And I think the classic case for demonstrating this is an American case called Pearson and Post, which is a New York decision. And It's also a wonderful case that everyone should know about because the facts in it are just so brilliant. And so what happens in this case is that the plaintiffs are hunting a fox, so that there's a fox hunt. And the plaintiff has been chasing the fox with hounds and on horses, and they've been doing this for a long time. They've been chasing it and chasing it and chasing it and chasing it, right? And eventually the fox gets exhausted, and they're just about to catch the fox when the defendant rushes out from behind some bushes or whatever it is, grabs the fox, nicks off with it. Okay, and the plaintiff, having spent all this time chasing the fox, is not very happy about this and sues the defendant for what we would call trespass. Okay, now whether the plaintiff can succeed depends on who owned the fox, because the plaintiff can sue the defendant in trespass only if the plaintiff owned the fox, right? So the idea is, I owned that fox, you came along and you nicked off with it, right? That's a trespass. You're stealing my property. Okay, you're trespassing to my property. So the question in the case, the central question in the case is, can the plaintiff establish that he owned the fox? The plaintiff's argument was, the court, you should recognize that I own the fox because I labored. I've been chasing this fox for ages before the defendant came along and whipped off with him. That argument failed. The court did not accept it. The court position was, in effect, the owner of the fox was the defendant, not the plaintiff. And so the plaintiff was unable to sue the defendant in trespass because the defendant, not the plaintiff, was the owner of the fox. Why? Well, the position seems to be this: labour itself gives no title. What gives title is control. The defendant owned the fox because the defendant gained control of the fox. The plaintiff never had control of the fox. Yes, the plaintiff laboured on the fox, chased it for hours or whatever it was, but that gives no title. What gives title is not labour but control. The defendant went and grabbed the fox. That's control. Defendant has title. So therefore, the plaintiff failed to bring a case, to succeed in the case against the defendant. So what I think this shows is that the law agrees with Nozick, that labour is not important. Labour doesn't give title. So I think Shapiro is wrong to say that nobody takes Nozick's argument seriously. I think our legal structures are built on taking it seriously. So I think this is a very significant problem for Locke. Secondly, if we think about the enough and is good argument, remember how that was supposed to go? I take some commons land as my private property, but Locke says I leave enough and is good for everybody else because my taking the land as private property means I'm going to cultivate it, I'm going to be industrious with respect to it, I'm going to create wealth, and everyone will be better off in the long run. Now, you might doubt that, but let's just accept it for the moment. There's another problem here, and that is this: haven't I made other people worse off in respect to this commons land, even if they become materially better off in the long run? Think about it this way: these other people who used to graze their cattle on the, or whatever it is, let's just say they were cows, graze the cattle on the commons land. These people used to work for themselves. Okay, they were in control of their own lives. But now that I've enclosed the commons land, they can't keep a cow for themselves, right? Because they've got nowhere to feed it. They're going to have to come and work for me. Now, I might pay them well. I might pay them more than they were effectively earning themselves. So their quality of their wealth might increase. Their wealth might increase. But there's a difference that in the past, they were working for themselves. Now they're working for me. Does that not mean that there's a very clear sense in which they are worse off than they were before? Even though they're wealthier than they were before, they have more money. Maybe they live in they can afford to buy more food or whatever it is than they had before. But they're less free than they were before, aren't they? They used to work for themselves and now they have to work for me. Now, here we see this curious shift in Locke's theory. In the beginning, when he's talking about natural rights and so on, it's all about freedom, Right? It's all about freedom and rights. But when we turn to property, it's all about the common good. Right? And that's a curious shift in Locke's theory. Right? We're not interested in, as Locke presents it, we're not interested in whether the person who's affected by the enclosure of the commons is free anymore. We're interested in how wealthy that person is. And that doesn't really seem to be justified by Locke's approach. If Locke's general approach is right, we should be asking, is this person still free? And it's not clear that the answer to that question is yes. That's debatable. Another criticism of Locke's view, and this is a general criticism, is that the arguments for Locke's conclusions seem to be missing. Locke gives us his picture. He tells us that there are natural rights, and he tells us that, what they are: life, life, health, liberty, possessions, and so on. But there doesn't seem to really be any argument for it in Locke. Why these natural rights? Why are there natural rights? Why these natural rights? Now, we know what Locke's answer was. It was because he found this in the Bible. But we've seen the problem with that. What if you don't believe in God? What if you don't believe in the same God as Locke? What if you believe in the same God, but you read the Bible and you get different rights or no rights at all? What are we to say about this? Now, I think this is a very significant criticism of Locke, that is, the arguments for his position are really missing. And some would say that what Locke offers is rhetoric rather than argument. It's just one big, long slogan. Now, I think that's a bit unfair, but I think there is nevertheless truth in this criticism. There's just too much argument missing from Locke to say that this is a genuinely serious political philosophy. Nevertheless, however, the position that Locke enunciates is an enduring one. Right? Maybe Locke doesn't provide the arguments, but maybe somebody else can. Maybe you can, right? Provide the arguments that Locke requires. It's a very enduring vision of the nature of politics. It's had a very significant impact, particularly in the United States, where it's thought that Locke's vision fits their constitutional arrangements closely. I don't really think that that's correct, but that's a very common view. I mean, for example, there's nothing in Locke about judicial review or anything like that. But nevertheless, right, there is this connection. Lots of American political theorists that I've come across think that sort of Locke is the founding father. Well, founding father is a word I shouldn't use in that context, but the sort of like the grandfather, the founding grandfather, right, if you like, of the vision of the United States Constitution. I'm not sure that that's actually correct, but that's a widely held view. So, although Locke leaves leaves a lot unfinished, right, the vision that he enunciates is a very powerful one and a very enduring one. Okay, that'll do for Locke. Next time we're going to start talking about utilitarianism.